Randolph Nogel reporting from Mexico City. Well, to discuss the country's incoming president and the challenges he faces, I'm joined by the editor of El Heraldo newspaper, Jose Carreno. And we have Marco Antonio Fernandez. He's a research professor at the Monterrey Institute of Technology and Higher Education. From the University of San Diego, Professor David Shirk joins us. He has written and edited several books about Mexican crime and politics. Welcome to the Newsmakers, all three of you. Jose, whichever way you look at it, whether you're pro or anti-Obrador, whether you're left or right, this is a new dawn for Mexico, is it not? Just give us your outstanding thoughts about the presidency of Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador, who, after this question, I at least will refer to as Amlo.
Well, his perspectives are good in the sense that he has a lot of support. He has virtually the control of the country in the sense that he will have a Congress on his favor, a judiciary power that will be very much leaning for him, and a public opinion that is very much open and expectant for his deeds. However, his problem will be that to put the promises to effect. That will be the main issue, because a lot of people in Mexico expects that it will be a virtual miracle and that things will change from the one day to the next. And this is an expectation that he and his people are trying to damp down. Otherwise, he might face a very fast demise of his political honeymoon. So Mr. Lopez Obrador has a very daunting challenge. He has there is a lot of expectations, there is a lot of sympathy, but the hopes might be quelled very soon.
Interesting. Marco, you have a fairly unique perspective in terms of the panelists that we're speaking to today, because you've been talking to the incoming government about potential reforms that need to be undertaken. What are your greatest concerns for AMLO's new leadership?
Well, I mean, as Jose mentioned, undoubtedly, I mean, it's a president that is arriving with a huge expectation, with a broad support of the Mexican citizens who clearly sent him a mandate basically to fight corruption, to develop the rule of law in Mexico, and to evade poverty and inequality. And in that sense, I mean, these are key areas that are essential for development in Mexico, and that it's going to have a hard time, the new government, to fulfill these expectations. I mean, at the core of the main problems of Mexico undoubtedly is the lack of the rule of law. I mean, clearly the institutions in charge of bringing justice to Mexico are very weak. And in that sense, I mean, I would say that the main challenge that the incoming president has is to develop a real civil service that is capable to develop the policies necessary to fulfill the expectations and to achieve good results in these areas, in the area of the rule of law, in fight effectively poverty and evade inequality, and once and for all finish or curb at least the huge corruption problems that Mexico is facing. And in that sense, I would say that so far we have seen positive and also worrisome signs on the proposals that the new government is trying to develop.
David, all of these challenges are not unique to Mexico. On the other side of the world, a new leader has been elected in Pakistan who faces almost the mirror problems that Mexico is facing. What is it that's particular to Mexico that will make AMLO's job in terms of the reforms necessary easier or more difficult?
I think that's a great question. I'm not an expert on Pakistan, so I can't quite make the comparison. But I think for Mexico, one of the things that could make Mexico's job, AMLO's job, both easier and harder is that it is located so close to the United States. Mexicans often lament the problem by saying, poor Mexico, so close to the United States, so far from God. And maybe Pakistan has the opposite problem. But I think that for Lopez Obrador, his greatest challenge, this challenge of rule of law, is significantly complicated by the war on drugs. And it's something that his government is going to try to change in a very dramatic way over the next few years, possibly moving towards legalization of drugs, et cetera. But it is, unfortunately, Mexico's dilemma that it is located right next to the United States, which is the world's largest market for drugs, and also the leading champion of the current drug policy regime around the world. So Lopez Obrador has a very sticky challenge, I think, in trying to navigate that particular issue, and of course, that will complicate his ability to achieve rule of law in a country where, unfortunately, there's a high degree of corruption and a high degree of violence.
Marco, can you pick up on that and give us some examples of how you might advise the new government, how it could best go about trying to address these issues that David and you are both talking about?
Yes, I mean, from the academia and from civil society organizations, a group of us have been working for a long time in trying to develop, for example, a series of proposals to reform the Justice Department in Mexico. I mean, clearly at the core of the corruption and the impossibility of really tackling the violence and in generally the crimes in Mexico, it's the problem of the lack of a real Justice Department that is composed by merit-based people. Right now, unfortunately, most of, for example, of the police and the investigators are not appointed based on their merit, but basically because of their personal relationships or partisan considerations. And in order to change this situation, we need to go through a serious discussion on how to create a legal framework that establishes the basis for a professional Justice Department, where it is essential to have a political independence, but that political independence, in order to really produce results, needs to be accompanied precisely by reforms that professionalize the way that this Justice Department has worked so far. I mean, in things, basic things like the capacity of the current authorities to follow the money is non-existent. I mean, many of corruption cases in Mexico are not brought to justice because the authorities not only lack the independence, but lack the skills to make an effective investigation where they follow all the national and international transactions, where the networks of corruption tend to allocate the misuse of public funds that they are currently using for corrupt purposes.
Okay, Jose, I promise I'm not ignoring you, and I will come to you in just a minute. But just to continue this theme, David, police investigate just a quarter of murders in Mexico. 2017 saw the highest murder rate in the country's history. How can one presidential term sort all of these problems out? Judiciary, police investigations, violence, all of that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. In fact, most of those crimes, most of those murders that Mexico saw last year, over 30,000 murders, occurred at the state or local level and will be adjudicated by the state prosecutors and state and local police. So the president's ability to make change is somewhat symbolic. There are a couple of things that I think Lopez Obrador is trying to do that will be important. As Marco mentioned, the fact that there is a new model for the Justice Department in Mexico, a new national prosecutor, could be very important in going after some high-profile criminals. But you're correct that this is not a job that one person alone is going to be. Building the rule of law is not the job of one man. And one of the things that's going to help Lopez Obrador, I think, is that under the previous administration, there was a political reform that allows mayors and legislators to be reelected, which will ensure continuity in government at the local level in a way that may help to build professional police forces. I think it's something that people don't often focus on, but one of the great problems for police professionalism and even judicial sector professionalism in Mexico is the very high rate of turnover. People enter these jobs and they leave quickly because there's no incentive, no professional incentive to stay. So I'm hopeful that Lopez Obrador will have some conditions that will assist him, as well as many people working at the state and local level, to try to improve the rule of law in Mexico over the next 6 years and hopefully over the next few decades.
Okay, I'll come back to policies in a minute, but Jose, let's talk about the man himself. In our report, Randolph, who's been in Mexico making this series of special reports from Mexico on which we'll concentrate in more detail and dig in further during the week. Randolph says that Amlo is not going to take advantage of some of the benefits that come from the presidency. It suggests from the outside someone like Uruguay's Jose Mujica, a very humble man. What is he like?
Well, the problem is that there are some things that he has promised that have had very good reception among the people, meaning not the traps of the presidency, to leave Los Pinos residents, etc., which sounds very well. However, in terms of pragmatism, in practical terms, they are a bit more difficult. For instance, he can sell the presidential airplane, which is okay, no problem. But maybe he needs to have a more modest airplane for his travels around the country, because he will be traveling a lot. And he cannot rely on commercial or rented airlines. So that is one part. Those are small things that could build up to a number of other issues. Now, Lopez Obrador has a very interesting personality. Some people believe that he's a mixture of religious and political. Some people believe that he's sort of messianic. However, he appears to be a very well-grounded person. Either you agree or not with him, you have to accept that he is a man with a huge charisma and that people follows him. However, the next problem is that in Mexico, traditionally, the president is seen as a sort of a big father, the big giver of things, and the big donor. So he will have to face that sort of expectations with a more reduced budget, with a more reduced administrative corps by his own will. So it will be, I think he will find a number of problems.
Okay, Jose, let's stay with you. 1% of the population owns about half of Mexico's wealth. 53+ million people living below the poverty line. The Oxfam Mexico executive director says 48% of state schools have no access to sewage, 31% have no drinking water, 12.8% have no bathrooms or toilets, 11.2% have no access to electricity. Just a few examples of the inequality in Mexico. He's a socialist leader, but that presents a challenge in itself. Most of the world follows the neoliberal path. Those who choose the other path, they find their challenges are accentuated because at the end of the day, economics is also about money. Where's he going to get the money to do all of this and reduce the inequality?
That is part of his real challenge. He needs to convince that 1% that you mentioned to start investing in the country. He has to convince foreign companies that Mexico is a safe place to invest, so they will not be risking their investment. He has to convince Western Europe, he has to convince the US, he has to convince Asia to try that Mexico is a safe and good place to make business and a good base to make business towards the US and Latin America. So he has to give the rule of the law as a guarantee of that. He has to go for that. Second, he has to hurry up in terms of education. A big part of the problem is that a lot of the people that you mentioned that is in the lower rungs of economic society is also in the lowest rungs in terms of education and preparation. He has to train people. He has to find ways or create programs to train people. He believed that a lot of the money will come from the savings on corruption. he might be right to a degree, but that will never be enough for the huge needs of a country that has about 50 million, 60 million people in poverty and or below the levels of poverty. So the problem is, again, that I believe that the expectations are too many for the government of one person for 6 years.
Okay, 60 seconds each, David and Marcos, starting with you, David. But please, 60 seconds. You've been nodding while Jose has been talking.
I completely agree. The challenges are huge. Lopez Obrador has talked about trying to improve oil revenues, reduce corruption, and other ways of sort of becoming more efficient or better able to generate revenues. There is no escaping the fact that with such an extreme maldistribution of wealth and income, there will be a need, if Mexico truly wants to advance, to redistribute the pie. And that is ultimately what will be the most polemical and challenging thing for this government, because at the end of the day, Mexico's privileged and Mexico's wealthy will not want to have to give up the enormous share of the pie that they already control. And frankly, that's a debate that we have to deal with here in the United States, and it's a debate that I think is going to have to happen over the next several years around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Marco, over to you. Does being a socialist make Amlo an enemy of the rich, of the elite, of the establishment? And how does he get across his message to them?
I mean, I think that's just adding to what David and Jose mentioned. I mean, the real challenge for Lopez Obrador is that he understands symbols in politics. And that's why he's sending the first messages of austerity, for example, this idea that he's going to sell the presidential airplane or reduce salaries of top bureaucrats in order to consolidate the legitimacy on a new way of making public expenditure in Mexico. However, if it's true that there's going to be some savings if corruption is curbed, unavoidably, as in Mexico, we will need to have a serious discussion on tax reform, and that is popularly a sensitive issue. So far, he has promised that he's not going to raise taxes, but in order to really redistribute wealth in Mexico, two things are necessary. On the one hand, tax reform, but also effective evidence-based policies that leave aside the clientelistic networks that traditionally have translated in misuse of the social programs precisely that supposedly are tackling poverty and inequality in Mexico. And that is going to be a huge challenge for the incoming president.
Okay, Marco, thank you very much indeed. David and Jose as well, a great way to start our week-long special on Mexico. Really appreciate it. Thank you.